Hey, everybody, it's Chris Aiken from the Classic Metal Show and the Aftershocks podcast. And I know you want to see this next episode, but right before we do it, just want to remind you that if you have an Amazon device, whether it's a TV or a Fire Stick or Fire Cube or whatever it would be, a Firebox if you're old school, make sure you add the CMSPN to it. Just look up CMS Podcast Network on your Amazon device. Add the channel, and you will get every episode of all 4 shows for free right there on your TV. Make us part of your TV viewing every single day and night, all right? It's the CMS Podcast Network, cmspn.com, and it is now on Amazon. So get it, all right? All right, here's the episode you came to see. All right, here we go. Shockwave Skull Sessions, episode number 116. Of course, we got the Armenian maven of metal himself, the creator of the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast, Mr. Bob Nalbanian. Bob, what's happening? How you doing?
I'm doing good. I'll never live that down.
You never will. I know. And of course, we got with us, I guess, today, author and journalist who's been in the hard rock and metal genre, man, for decades now. He's co-authored one of the best, I think, comprehensive metal books out there called Louder Than Hell. And he's also co-authored books from Scott Ian, Al Jourgensen from Ministry, Roger Moret from Agnostic Front, talking about Mr. Jon Wiederhorn. John, how you doing, man? Thanks for coming on.
Doing good. Thanks for having me.
Awesome, man. Yeah, well, we'll get into it, John, right away. I mean, you're here to talk about your new podcast, Backstaged, The Devil in Metal. Mm-hmm. You got an episode, looks like every Friday it comes out, 12 in total, I believe, correct?
Yep.
That you're doing for this?
We're on, up to episode 3. Episode 4 debuts this Friday.
Yeah.
Crazy.
And yeah, it's great, man. I mean, I've listened to the episode so far. I'm really enjoyed it a lot. I think it's a great, idea you came up with this podcast. But I guess just to start off, I guess just tell us about, what made you, do Backstage and how the idea for this came to fruition at this time.
Well, it's interesting. I did Louder Than Hell about 10 years ago, and I had a great experience doing that book, which it was really an oral history of metal from the 60s to the early 2000s, told through the voices of all the different musicians from the different genres. So it's an oral history, very little opinion in there from me. And one of the coolest parts I thought about it was the great stories that I got from the different musicians, not just, we formed in a garage that was downtown from where I used to work, and blah blah, because all bands kind of form more or less in the same way, unless there's an exceptional story. But what I thought was really cool was the stories of what happened once they made a name for themselves, or as they were trying to make a name for themselves, or how they were surviving, where they were sleeping, what they were driving in, and if there were accidents in the on the way, and just what the metal lifestyle is like for a touring, traveling musician. Hard word there. So, years later, I kind of wanted to revisit some of that territory, but I'd already told this history thing. So I thought it'd be cool to do a book that just examined individual aspects of metal, especially the metal culture and lifestyle, like looking at the parties backstage, or looking at the frenzied road trips, or the Spinal Tap like experiences, all this stuff. So I chronicled all that in a book called Raising Hell: Backstage Tales from the Lives of Metal Legends. And I did that for a company called Diversion Books. And lo and behold, that came out in 2020, early 2020, before everything collapsed in the world.
Yeah.
But while things were in this period of stasis and everyone was treading water, Diversion decided to delve into podcasts. So they talked to a lot of their writers and figured which writers might work well having their book converted into a podcast form, or elements of their books. And they asked if I was into it, and I said, yeah, totally. But we didn't want to just retell these same stories from the book. We wanted to come up with kind of an approach to metal and a general statement about metal. And we started with we had a couple episode ideas, and then the idea of the occult in metal was just sort of thrown around. And it's interesting to see how the occult entered the genre, and from Black Sabbath all the way through to Gorgoroth and Behemoth, or whoever, who's taken the occult seriously, who's used it as a gimmick. If there have been people who've been, motivated by these bands to do awful things. And then playing around with it a bit, we came up with the name The Devil in Metal. Now, I thought that would just be for like those first couple episodes, but they thought it'd be a good kind of title with an overarching theme to the whole series. So in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way, we kind of said, yeah, this is the devil music, man. Everyone says metal is the devil music, and don't listen to it or you're gonna go to hell. So we thought, well, what's all embracing about metal that accompanies these conservative ideas of evil and malfeasance or whatever. And we came up with a lot of these topics that are also addressed in Raising Hell, but the idea of drinking, in excess, and the crazy stories, both good and bad, that accompany that, and the people who got in trouble, going that route. Came up with a chapter on the treatment of women in metal, not musicians exclusively, but every dude who plays in a band's fantasy is to hook up with chicks.
Sure.
And it's ever since the days of Zeppelin, that was an aim for all these guys. Elvis, yeah, that's true. The Beatles. So it's funny because right now it's kind of like you don't want to even say that because of the Me Too movement, which I'm totally in favor of, and I think it's terrible for people to take advantage of unconsenting people. But when it's a consensual relationship, I don't see anything wrong with it, and everything goes. And a lot of dudes I talked to for the episode that airs on Friday seem to feel the same way, and have some really great and wild stories from the members of Van Halen in the early days of picking up chicks on the road, and Diamond Dave looking out in the audience and pointing to the girls that he wanted to come backstage afterwards, to Dave Windor from Monster Magnet, who's just this self-effacing hell machine of great stories. And he told some really funny anecdotes, and lived rock and roll the fullest. Like, he's all about the sex, and was about the drugs and the drinking until it got too out of hand, and like so many people, he had to cut that out of the diet. But yeah, there's all these factors that people think metal encompasses, so we really want to dive into them without throwing anyone under the bus or making light of serious issues. I have a whole episode about heroin in metal, which was hard to address because a lot of really great musicians have died from it, and it's nothing to trifle with. And like Lemmy said, Lemmy from Motorhead obviously said the one drug he's glad he never ever messed with is heroin, and if he did, he'd be an idiot. And Ozzy said he'd be dead if he ever did heroin. So, but for those who survive it, they, in addition to being able to tell all these horrible stories of being strung out and vomiting, in the backstage club in some divey place, or shooting up in a dirty bathroom, they also have, a lot of them, these wild stories of what they did when they were in desperate need of heroin, or what happened while they were trying to score, or what a particular trip was like while they were on stage, if it was not a trip, if they were strung out and shooting up. So people like Al Jourgensen, who's one of the funniest guys who's ever lived, super smart dude, and Dave Navarro from Jane's Addiction, all had really, really interesting takes on their experiences. And having survived those years, those decades, they were able to look back at it and say, don't try this at home, but I've got some stories to tell.
Sure. Yeah. Now the interviews you've done, were these interviews that you had done previously, or did you do them specifically for this podcast?
A lot of them were done specifically for the podcast.
Okay.
I came up with the specific ideas. I nailed down who I wanted to talk to. And then I went back into my archives and said, well, I've gotten stories about this stuff before because they're kind of tropes of metal, and who has some really wild, or interesting stories. And for instance, Eddie Van Halen, may he rest in peace, told me some really great and I don't want to say intimate because they're not, but he was into the groupie scene in the beginning, like all the other dudes in the band. And then he said, what the hell am I doing? This is not fulfilling. And I'm not, aside from like saying, hey, I hooked up with 3 chicks last night. Like that didn't fulfill his artistic or intellectual goals. And that's when he started, taking different floors in hotel suites while his bandmates continued to, scope the field, I guess. He said shortly after that he found Valerie. So it's kind of cool to hear stories like that, and then to talk to someone like Evan Seinfeld from Biohazard, who's just a huge walking penis, literally, and probably proud to be.
Sure, yeah.
Done porn movies, directed them, scoring chicks in every way possible in Biohazard. So he was totally unapologetic about his crazy ass exploits through the years. So it was, it's a cool combination of all of these, wild experiences that go into metal. And I think anybody who's a metal fan or who has lived the metal lifestyle can relate to a lot of it, or at least enjoy it.
Sure.
It's definitely a unique angle for a metal podcast, because everyone thinks now, everyone and their mother's doing a podcast, and there's so many metal podcasts out there. But, after, hearing what this is about, the sex, the drugs, the occult, and, was a lot of it based in the 80s, the genre I grew, I even back in the 70s, I kind of, grew up in that era when I was a young kid, but my whole, later teenage and in my 20s, I lived that life. I was in Hollywood. I was a part of that whole LA metal scene. And so for me, I love the honesty approach of it. And as you said, nowadays it's frowned upon and this and that, but this is how it was back then. And the artists are being honest about it. And let's face it, everyone says about, it's so misogynist and all this kind of stuff, but the women were into it. I've talked to a lot of the women and the groupies that, from back then, I talk to them now, that I've known, and they said, I don't regret anything. Those were the best times of my life. So, and
some of them were really smart girls,
Absolutely.
They were stupid dudes and they were dumb chicks, but there were also some really smart people just living out their fantasies and having a good time.
Sure. So I like the fact that you get into that, and the other thing that's so funny, because I'm thinking about kids nowadays, millennials or even, pre that, before, that grew up in, whatever, through the 90s and stuff. They don't realize the impact of the, bands like Venom and these satanic bands. I remember when that In League of Satan single just came out. I read about them in the first issue of Kerrang, and I got it as, a 14, 15-year-old kid, if that, and it just scared the bejesus out of me. I was like, whoa, this is like, I shouldn't be listening. I had to listen to my headphones because my mom ever heard me hearing that, she would have put me in an insane asylum. That's how the occult, but people nowadays, you hear Cannibal Corpse and all, now it's silly. You listen to Venom or even early Slayer, that was considered silly, but you go back to the PMRC and all the crazy shit that was going on during then, particularly about the occult. Of course, the whole rock and roll lifestyle, the sex and this, that, but the occult was such a big thing. And it was like, these bands are, if you listen to this, you're going to hell, you're a Satanist and all this kind of stuff. So, well,
there was that era where there was the satanic panic in the 80s.
Sure.
And, it came because we were from pretty much the same generation. Our parents didn't know what metal was. They barely knew what rock and roll was. And if you grew up in the 50s or the 40s, even the 60s, the early 60s, you had these certain ideas of how people behaved and how money was made and how society interacted. And it wasn't all about rebellion, and it wasn't all about, free love. And these ideas scared the shit out of parents, So they had to blame these loose morals and this aberrant behavior on something. So the church said, well, it's got to be Satan. It's got to be the devil that's gotten into this music and is controlling these kids. And it all happened like with this culture at the same time, where you had Anton Szandor LaVey was running the Church of Satan and getting pretty popular. People like Sammy Davis Jr. were, out of curiosity, were joining, and a lot of intellectual people were having what do they call those parties where you put your key in a bowl, some parties, and then this swapping thing where and big cocaine parties, and so there was this decadent lifestyle that was going around, and people had an interest in the occult because it was just like another thing out there. Like Rosemary's Baby was huge, and The Exorcist, and then the explosion of that caused every other horror movie to tackle that. Speaking of which, do I look like some zombie ghost figure? Because I can dim a light if I look too fucking pale in this thing.
No, man, you look fine. Yeah.
All right. For me, the screen looks like shit. But okay, not that I care, but
we can adjust the color out.
Yeah. So it was this introduction to this whole lifestyle and this whole culture that Black Sabbath kind of brought to the world. And you had groups like Black Sabbath and Coven and Pentagram on a lower level. And Deep Purple were pretty big, and Richie Blackmore's Rainbow, and there was this mysticism that came along with Zeppelin too, and his interest in the unknown. And then once you had metal, people started saying, well, metal is great because it's surprising and it's shocking and it ups the ante. But if you're going to keep doing that, you got to keep making it more extreme. And if you want to do stuff that's about the occult, Slayer can't just say, oh, there was a hooded figure at the foot of my bed and he pointed at me and said, you had better watch out or evil will become of you. So they write Hell Awaits and have these crazy ass demons on the cover pulling these dudes' intestines out. And that kind of crap blew me away in high school. I was like, oh, this is so sick. This is great. So for me, it's just been this like journey to just discover the more outrageous and extreme style of entertainment within this genre. And then I guess you stop when you've taken it as far as you can enjoy it. Because I love some death metal, I love black metal. Just because when I grew up, thrash is always really the music that's closest to my heart. But I'll never outlive Priest and Maiden and Sabbath and the Scorpions and all that stuff too. So it's just a culture that just goes on, and it's really cool because if you're into metal, you're into metal. I mean, I can tell by the enthusiasm that you dudes have for it, and you talk to a metal person, they're like metal for life. And, if they're in their 20s or in their late 50s, they've still got these great stories to share and amazing memories of having been part of that scene.
Sure. And, and I think, in your podcast, you do a great job, I think, of delving, into each individual. Like, for instance, you started off with Black Sabbath, obviously, you introduced the whole occult thing into metal. Then, of course, you got more into, talking about Venom when Venom wanted to take it a notch up. And then, of course, you get into, like you're talking about, death metal and black metal, where it became like that whole one-upsmanship, who was going to be more evil, Right. And the interesting thing is most of them, and as you point out, or some of the interviews dictate in there, it was really, or at least initially, it was all about just for the shock value, just to get that shock, just to get attention and just to continue to shock. But like you said, you've got to then keep, increasing, I guess, these standards of what shock is. And it's funny because I'm not funny, but it's sad, I should say, that it eventually came to effect, the point where, at least in black metal, you had, Varg, committing murders, and, you had the Ricky Cassos of the world, the Say You Love Satan thing going on. So it did then started, taking, of course, this is a serious thing. I guess kids are listening and are actually going out and doing certain acts that maybe, I'm sure, like you said, these bands weren't really trying to, promote that. They were just promoting the whole shock and everything.
Yeah, the Norwegian scene is a really, odd and fascinating time for metal. A lot of tragedy and a lot of horrible shit went down, but damn, there are also some great albums that came out of that whole scene.
And albums, yeah.
The well, it was the second Mayhem album, Mysterious Dome Satanis. It's just brutal. It's fast. It's devastating. The guitars are razor sharp. And of course, you have Varg Vikernes playing bass on the album. And he and Euronymous at that point were, sort of having this it was a ridiculous, horrible feud that ended with Varg fearing for his life that Euronymous was going to kill him, which people close to Euronymous said was not the case at all. And then Varg ended up murdering Euronymous.
Mm-hmm.
And there were but Varg is also the one who pioneered the whole idea of burning churches. He was proud of that. And in a way, it was just from being young and stupid, being like a kid and wanting to be so fucking metal that he'd take it like to the extremes of things no one else had done. But then he bragged about it. He's like, hey, dude, I just burned this church, and took photos of the church burning and used it on a record. And pretty much did an interview with a local newspaper trying to, disguise his identity. But people in the scene knew who it was, and it wasn't long before the police figured it out. Mm-hmm. So, but there's a lot more to black metal than just that kind of inner circle. Even though Dark Throne were involved in the inner circle, I don't know if they were burning churches. I don't think so, but they created some really intense, great music. Right. And Emperor, although some of the early members went to jail for misdeeds. Ishan and his bandmates have created some just insane, incredible music. So there's been a lot of really good stuff. I think it's come out of that scene, and so much of it has been sensationalized by the brutality. But you can't write off the brutality, because that was so part and parcel of what made it that next level shit. I mean, just totally next level. God, I was listening to Venom and Slayer. I thought Slayer were for real, and was disappointed kind of to find out that it was all, all for fun.
Back then, you can't get any more extreme than this, This is as extreme as it's ever going to get.
I had that same experience where I talk about it in the second episode. I'm sitting there in a record store looking at black metal, and listening to it because the record guy in the record store let me play it. I'm like, oh my God, they drink the vomit of the priest. This is the most insane shit I've ever heard. And it's not super tight, and it's not,
it gets silly, honestly. And not to knock the musicianship, some of those Scandinavian musicians are some of the top at their game. But, and Jonas Auckland, who directed Lords of Chaos, a friend of mine, he did a fantastic job. And it shows that
he was in Bathory, right?
He was the original drummer of Bathory.
Yeah, that's so cool. I love that.
The first compilation track he did, and then he left and got into directing. But
got a real career.
Exactly, that's what he thought.
I love Jonas Auckland
because
such a talented dude.
He's amazing. But it just really does show how they were just young, stupid kids, and that's what it was. And back then, you talk about the mystique, and that's what I love from back in the day. Early Black Sabbath, Zeppelin, Alice Cooper. You didn't know as a kid, you heard about Black Sabbath, you heard all this stuff. Jimmy Page bought Aleister Crowley's house. Is he a real Satanist? Is he? But you watched, the Song Remains the Same. You saw the big wizard, and you're like, wow, this is. But it was just fascinating. But they never came out. You never had people. They weren't interviewed. It wasn't, all over the press. So you kind of left to your imagination. And I remember seeing Alice Cooper, and I must have been in third grade when he was on the American Music Awards, and he, and Diana Ross, I don't know if you remember this, announced him, and he like kind of freaked out in front of him. I don't want to announce it, and he goes crazy. And I watch it now on YouTube, and it's laughable. But back then, I remember at school next day, Alice Cooper, he's really insane. He's a freak, But that was what was kind of cool. Of course, now everything is exploited, and my point is now it's kind of got to be where they know it's good publicity. Go back to the PMRC when all that stuff happened. I remember Stephen Craig, Slayer's then manager, who I knew, him and Carrie very well, and they, called me up, man, dude, we're gonna be on the news. We're gonna be on the news. This is the greatest thing for Slayer. The fact that Tipper Gore's holding up a Slayer record, and Betsy Bitch said the same thing. That gave them here they are, this underground metal band that nobody really knew of back then. That brought them into the mainstream light. And I think same with these black metal bands. They knew that, and they even talk about it like in the movie. And if you read the books, we gotta, that kind of music would never get into the mainstream press or into the newspapers, but by burning churches, being extreme. And it makes you think, even back in the 80s, how extreme after the whole satanic thing, you got into the sex and the drugs, you got the mentors, that said, we're going to push it even more. wear black hoods and talk about raping women and pillaging and pissing on chicks and being as vulgar as possible.
But they were, but they were just vulgar for,
of course, it was a joke.
Stupidity.
But then you get it like Gigi Allen, who goes extreme,
right,
shits on the audience and does all this punk.
Do you ever see him
killing himself? I wouldn't go. I've got invited to shows back. I had some punk. Oh, Gigi Allen, you got to go see him. Fuck that. You want to get shit going on? You go to the show.
I was going to stand in the back row at his Halloween show in DC, which was supposedly when he was going to kill himself.
Yeah, I was never into that punk scene. But you watch that documentary, but it's like that's it was all for taking it to the next level. And that's what I liked about the old days. You had that mystique where it was, you never really kind of knew, and it wasn't this publicity. Let's do it for the publicity sake of it. And not to say a lot of these bands weren't. I mean, obviously Slayer are incredible musicians, incredible, but they knew in the beginning this will get them a lot of publicity. This is good publicity. The bad, we want the parents to hate us. We want this is good for us to have this kind of stuff. But
but I mean, I totally agree with you. But at the same time, I think there was a purity back then where these dudes were like, fuck the mainstream stuff. We're going to put this out on an indie record, or we'll do it ourselves. And we're going to sing about horror movies, or serial killers, which is what we love. And we're going to play this faster than Motorhead because, that's what we can do. And we have the chops. And I don't think there was this, it would have sucked if there was this premeditated plan, I mean, it was a fringe benefit.
Once it came out, the cool thing is they could have looked at it like, oh, this is a bad publicity, but they said, fuck this. We're going to use this to our advantage, So it was kind of like, when all that shit came out in the press, they said, bring it on, man. We're not. They didn't go Christian right after it. They didn't apologize. In this day and age, you would have to apologize after.
Yeah, no, they were totally punk rock about
it. We didn't mean that. We didn't mean to harm our words. I'm sorry if our words hurt you guys. We were just, it wasn't all for real. We didn't, And then you had the more serious stuff, the suicides with, Judas Priest. And the Black Sabbath Suicide Solution and Judas Priest, Better By You, Better Than Me. I mean, there was some serious stuff, and good thing these bands stood up for it. Priest had a whole court battle with it, and they were right. It's like, hey,
they were totally right, but they were also devastated.
That was an old,
it was a cover song, but they were really crushed. No,
it was
these
something
kids,
crushing. Yeah,
these kids loved the band.
Absolutely.
The two kids who were manipulated. By their horrible parents and their terrible lifestyle and their drug addictions in these really dysfunctional environment they were in, that the best thing they could think to do is to blow their heads off. That's so tragic on its own. But then the one who survives listens to his mom, whose priest is telling her this was the devil, and this was this band. They led this band into manipulating your kids, and it was through these backwards messages, because they couldn't get them for forwards messages that it's protected under the First Amendment.
Sure.
And there's a great movie called I think Dreamer Deceiver or Dream Deceivers.
It's very depressing.
It's such a great documentary about that whole escapade. And actually, the last two episodes of Backstaged are going to be a story about Priest, but mostly through the eyes of Rob Halford, from the beginning of his life all the way up to the present day. And he put out his book Confess last year, in which he was very open about his lifestyle and all the tragedy really that he lived through, and the emotional turmoil that he endured when he was gay and could not admit it. He couldn't come out in the 80s in a metal band because it was a really homophobic era. You had who was it? Sebastian Bach, who was wearing the T-shirt that said "AIDS kills, fags dead," which is kind of ironic because Sebastian Bach is so not homophobic now, and maybe he was at the time, or maybe he was just joking around. Bad joke to wear on stage, but MTV took him to town for it and ripped him up. But then he made it up on Broadway, so. But it's just crazy, and the story of Priest is a fantastic story, and that Rob's book is great. And once he did the book, I haven't seen a ton of press that he did after it, because it was right during COVID, and I was too busy thinking that we were in the middle of the apocalypse. But when I read the book and interviewed him for it, he was so open and honest, and I mean, I have a history of having interviewed him for 15 years.
He's
So
a great
maybe he
dude, yeah.
opened up
Great
especially to
interview.
me, but maybe that was just everything he was talking about. But there's some heavy stuff in that interview about, his boyfriend at one point killed himself right in front of Rob with a gun, and Rob saw the gun but didn't think anything of it. He's like, I was being dramatic, he couldn't possibly do anything. And he found out later it wasn't in front of him, but as soon as they went their separate ways, he found out this guy went into his house and
Some crazy
killed
stories
himself.
back in the
No, it's
80s
crazy.
and 90s. Yeah.
Yeah,
Lots of
crazy.
stuff. And, it's
And,
good that you reveal a lot of this stuff. That just, it's just stuff that happened. It's part of history.
right.
It's something that, it's good that you're telling it through this podcast medium. Like I said, it's definitely a different angle than, your typical, interviews. You use a lot of interviews that, from the artists themselves, from either archive interviews or current interviews, which adds to it, which I think is a great thing. Yeah.
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up because I love podcasts, and I love the podcast thing where someone sits down with a musician or writer or a painter or whatever and talks and does the one-on-one interview thing, and they get deep in the weeds a lot of times. But I didn't really think I had anything new to add to that format, and I love true crime podcasts. And what I really like about them is this narrative structure where they're telling a story of what happened and what horrible things someone did, if it's like a serial killer story, or what their childhood was like and how they became emotionally or behaviorally stunted and dysfunctional. And they go through this arc. So there's a story there. I really kind of wanted to bring that style to a metal podcast. So with each episode, I try to tell a story and also involve, I hate talking about myself, but my producers are like, you got to bring yourself into it because you've been this metal fan for fucking 40 years, and you have crazy stories too. I'm like, no, I've never been like shooting up and under a bridge. They're like, yeah, but you're with people who are doing that, and you probably have some stupid crazy stories too. And so I got to talk about reading the Satanic Bible in my high school library just to freak people out. And when I told Gary Holtz,
carried it in your library.
What's that? No, I brought it in. I was just being an asshole. A friend of mine who was in a band with at the time were like, let's just go in front of all these preppy kids because it was the 80s and there was just like everyone had these Izod and polo shirts and we just hated it. And jocks and cheerleaders everywhere. So we thought we'd just like take out the book and like, you said the song, and just
remember AC/DC was the first band that was real. Sabbath too, but AC/DC were very satanic back in the day. Supposedly,
they played with
Ramirez thing.
Well, they played with ideas of hell, but there was nothing really satanic.
Of course not.
About
the way the press made it. Because I remember wearing an AC/DC shirt back in the day, and then after Back in Black, once it became big, then you said all the preppies and everything. Everyone's getting into AC/DC. And, oh my God, AC/DC spreading the word of the devil to the
Well, it's kind of,
Well, and the runway models, in the 90s were running around with Motorhead t-shirts on and stuff. These skinny, like heroin chic girls. I'm like, oh man, really? I once asked Lemmy about that. He's like, this is fucking great. I just get to sell more shirts that way.
Nice. Well,
you got the merchandise money.
It is interesting now, though, because you really do see satanic imagery. Everywhere. Society really has become desensitized to it over the last couple of decades. Look at even in pop music, you had that whole thing that happened with like Lil Nas X and Nike with the shoe. You had the Kardashians are wearing Death Angel and Slayer t-shirts now. There's very little. Absolutely. It's there's like not really that shock obviously anymore when it comes to satanic imagery. In fact, it's probably the opposite, where now Christianity's become sort of the new Satanism, where it's like roles have kind of been reversed in sort of in a way.
Well, geez, look at what these people are accusing regular God-fearing Americans. They don't need to be God-fearing, but like these people like QAnon. That's lunacy in my book. I hope I don't lose listeners that way. But when you have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about, Jews causing space lasers to light the like fire to the trees in California, like that's some like science fiction crap. It's definitely a weird.
Yeah, it's it's just I think the whole environment, like I said, where like I'll give like example, like even a guy like Frankie Palmieri, a singer of the band Muir.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, he's made a song I think about someone shooting up a school or something like that. Which because there's all the school shootings going on, and I mean he got hammered to death by these local newspapers in like Houston, and I mean just coming to go off. I mean they're not even there to interview him; it's really just to kind of lecture him. And I'm looking at his lyrics, and I'm like, what? I've seen worse lyrics in death metal songs and black metal songs. You know what I mean?
Didn't Neil Young write a song about the shooting in Ohio 50 years ago?
Yeah, that's right.
That was like one of his.
Or dead in Ohio, right?
Yeah.
He never got shit for that, but yeah.
But remember Slayer's most famous and arguably best song, "Angel of Death," got. They were crucified when it came out. Like they were totally torn apart for writing a song about Joseph Mengele. And it's a brutal, brutal song about, a horrific subject, but they didn't embrace. And that's where I draw the line. Like they told this horror story, a historical horror story, through the lens of stuff that really happened in a very realistic way. And a lot of the Jewish community lost their minds because it seemed, when you're screaming "Angel of Death" and it's about Joseph Mengele, it could be misinterpreted as being something where, these guys are singing his praises. But, then you do get, NSBM or these artists that hate a particular group, not like just a general hate of Christianity or organized religion or whatever. But I mean, people can like what they want musically, and thank God for the First Amendment. But where I draw the line as to what I'll listen to is, where you have these hateful individuals like Varg Vikernes and, who's a total neo-Nazi shithead. Like, don't even want to talk about him because he's like such a waste of space. But then that's where they're wasting, to me, that's where it's just not art anymore. It's not music. It's just hate.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, there is a line to draw there where if you cross a certain, line, it's like, you're not, it's not so much, like you said, it's not so much art anymore. It's become something, deeper or bigger or worse than, beyond art, where it becomes more of an actionable type of thing. But, just getting real quick, John, back to the podcast thing, I mean, because you're a guy, I mean, you've been a journalist now for years. I mean, do you see, the podcast world, is that becoming sort of the new way for journalism? Because to me, what I see with a lot of, like with metal fans, whether they're, younger generation of metal fans, or even, people our age, the old school metal fans, I mean, no one really likes to read anymore. I've noticed. I mean, I do. I still love reading, but everyone wants it sort of told to them. And just like, you see such a rise with the auditory books too. Everyone likes to just kind of be in their car and put that on and let it be dictated to them and have the authors talk to them. Do you, I mean, as a guy who's been doing this now, I mean, do you see that this is probably the at least for now, the modern way of journalism is something you're going to probably do more of to do more of these sort of series like you're doing with Backstage?
Well, I really enjoy doing it. And, the reception so far has been really much better than I could have hoped for. I'm really excited that there has been this reaction to it. It's funny, you do an article for a magazine, and I wrote for magazines for decades, and I loved interviewing some of these bands. And when I was 14, if I could have imagined going to California and spending 2 days with Slayer, I would have been shitting myself with happiness. Yeah. I mean, it didn't make me rich, but it was a pretty awesome thing to do.
Yeah.
But I think to a large extent, musicians and writers are now in that kind of same boat where, it used to be something that if you worked really, really hard at it and you were good and you got the right breaks, then you could make a living and you could have a following. And if you're a band, you could have all the chicks, not so much the writers. But, it's a changed world. The whole digital environment has totally changed the music scene, obviously, not saying anything anyone doesn't know. But bands don't make money from selling records anymore. and they used to make most of their money selling records, and then they'd tour and lose money. And now it's the opposite, where they've had to find ways to tour in an economically viable way. And some of that's been, it's funny because some of that has happened because of technology. Like they've been able to do things with technology that's a lot cheaper now than the type of special effects they might have tried pulling off, when Alice Cooper was shooting himself out of a cannon or whatever.
Point, yeah.
But it takes the art of making an album and kind of marginalizes it in a way, because the great bands are still going to make records and they're devoted to it. And to me, that's, what I was always in it for as much as a live show, but they don't get the reward for it. And you can understand why someone might say, well, fuck it, man. I'm not going to get paid anything for being in the studio for 3 months and, killing myself to make a record that was better than the last one. So why not just tour and play summer festivals or whatever? So it's a weird scene that writers are kind of caught in the middle of as well, because there are no magazines anymore, I mean, there's a couple metal magazines, but not like there used to be, There were like 10 or 15 places you could write about metal bands. Now there's maybe 2 or 3. And then there are websites, and there's some great websites. I mean, I love, I don't want to name some and not name others, but some have been really cool to me in coverage, and some have hated my shit, which is totally fine. But it's that other outlet where writers have like scrambled to, and unfortunately there's not the kind of money there that there used to be in magazines when there was a lot of money floating around and people were selling huge advertisement. Oh yeah, photographers got totally fucked. They used to, oh god, these guys used to make the good ones, the really good ones, could make a lot of money on these photo shoots. All those guys, sure. Bands, and as Lilsour did. He made a killing in the 80s and had a great time. So you got to roll with the changes and figure out something to do if you're, and I've been lucky and I've been able to get into the book writing scene and have some success with that. And now hopefully the podcasting thing will keep going, because it is a great new forum, and everyone's in their cars, so they're listening to podcasts driving to work. And like I said, I love true crime podcasts. I'm always listening to fucked up stories about my favorite. I don't want to say my favorite, because saying favorite in serial killers isn't it's not a good look. But there's a real interesting story in there. And what's really funny, during this whole COVID thing, it seems to me like all these networks are putting on more and more CSI and Criminal Minds and true investigative tales of basically based on the criminal experiences or exploits of serial killers. And it's like, everyone watches it now because, why the hell not? And Donnie Wahlberg's doing like America's Scariest People or something.
Oh, wow, okay.
And like doing, and HBO was wall-to-wall serial killer documentaries. I mean, it's a weird time.
They're almost heroes now.
It's different.
Crazy. It's like
and that's bad. I condemn it, obviously. But the stories that these people have of how they were caught,
they're interesting,
why they did what they did. There's some interesting stuff there.
No, there really is. There really is, man. Hey, John, there's one question. I remember the first article I ever read that you did. I think it was when you were was for MTV News. It was back in the early 2000s, probably about like 20 years ago. I think it was when Chuck Schuldiner from Death was sick, and I know there was like some sort of fundraiser thing that was going on, and and the guy, and the funny is, the guy who I found out who ran it was a guy who's, the reason I'm asking, because he's been in the news lately, Tom Hazard was the guy that I guess was running that, and it just seemed really a very shady situation. Was there ever any follow up on that whole thing that would happen with that? Do you know at all?
With what happened with the money and what happened? I never did a follow up on it. I know that poor Chuck Schuldiner and his family, man. It's just been a brutal. At least the dudes who played in the band with him, a lot of people like Gene Hoglan and the guy from Cynic, Paul Masvidal, was it him? I think he was in that band. They did the Death for All tribute tour and gave all that money to Chuck's family, and God, they're probably still paying those medical bills. Probably, that was just such a tragedy and a bummer, and it happened when no one cared about metal. I had to beg to write the story It was like, I'm like,
Okay.
I don't understand how important this guy was.
Yeah.
But that was when everything looked like it was, done for the purest of motives.
Mhm.
And, to learn that money was mishandled, as happened with We Are the World or whatever, it's always a tragedy. People just suck.
Yeah, for the most part, I know they really do, unfortunately. But okay, well, I guess we'll start winding it down. Bob, do you got anything else you want to talk about?
No, man, just go ahead and give out. I know your podcast is available everywhere. It launched a couple weeks ago, the 14th. So you're on your fourth episode. Let people know how to get a hold of it, and as well as some of your books. I know you did Louder Than Hell, like you mentioned, with Catherine Turman, and the Scott Ian book. Go ahead and give some plugs out before we end this.
Sure. Well, I think one that got a little bit overlooked because it hit right before the whole kind of COVID disaster. And I'm sorry about the tribal drums in the background. My phone's ringing. But Raising Hell: Backstage Tales from the Lives of Metal Legends is it's a really fun read, and my agent called it a bathroom book. He's like, I mean that in the best way, but you leave it in the shitter and you just flip to a page randomly, and you can read some crazy ass story about someone and something that happened. Nice. And what was cool about doing that book is I already kind of knew who had great stories to tell about, falling off stage or getting in gang fights or, being in these ridiculous Pantera style drinking and destruction escapades, or who had heroin stories, who had alcohol stories, with puke stories. So I reached out and cherry picked people who I knew would give me great quotes. And then there's some fucking maniacs, like King. Do you know King Fowley?
King Fowley?
Yeah. Sure. Not Kim Fowley or King?
No, King. Is it King? Am I screwing up his name?
Kim Fowley was the Runaways.
With the Runaways. No, King.
Yeah. There is a guy that goes by the name of King Fowley.
It's King Fowley. Okay.
No, King Fowley is a different guy.
No, he's in a band. Yeah, he's in a thrash metal band from the 80s.
Exactly.
Going, and God bless him for it. Yeah. But he had these insane, really, he gratuitously sexual, messed up groupie stories that he was so excited to tell.
Oh, Kim Fowley,
King, yeah.
King. Okay.
But now I'm almost having a brain fart because I'm wondering if I have his last name right. From the band. Now I'm fucking up.
He was in a bunch of bands, and he's a big metal.
Yeah, he was in right. October 31st, I think is the name of one of his bands.
Kim Fowley goes way back to the.
Oh, 60s. Kim Fowley's back in the Runaways, and Lita Ford and Joan Jett, and the
exploitation. And he's got some insane
stuff.
I worked on a project.
He died, right?
Him. He died a few years ago.
Yeah,
that dude had some insane groups.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. But what's interesting is before he died, Cherry Curry.
They became real close. Yeah.
Which is amazing considering, how much messed up stuff happened when the Runaways were being managed by him, and how much of it he could have exploited them. So he's been accused of it for sure. And I don't want to talk poorly of the dead, but for someone like Cherry Curry to make up and, kind of.
They realized because Kim did. I mean, even though it was kind of the school of hard knocks. He taught them, you're chicks, you're going to be, this. But, was it wrong? Yeah, probably. But I think she realized that he's the one that really got the Runaways off the ground. And going. So I think she kind of realized that. And when he was sick, which was a pretty amazing story that she kind of nursed him after that.
She did. She nursed him through his cancer and then stayed with him till his dying day.
Yeah.
And what a bunch of interesting, great people. Lita Ford, Joan Jett. It's like, it's too bad they'll never all get on the same page.
Yeah.
I just don't think Lita and Joan have any love left for each other, which is just too bad. But
it's unfortunate. Yeah. No,
Sandy's already passed away too. So
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So great. Want to close this out, Matt?
All right. Yeah. Well, so diversionpodcast.com. That's where everyone can check out the Backstage podcast. Correct, John? Just for the listeners.
Yep, and we're on iHeart and iTunes and really anywhere you listen to podcasts, it should be available. Okay. Look for the skull with the guitar headstock through the back of the head, awesome, red background stuff.
Yeah, great, man. Well,
everyone's got skulls. We
Yeah, it had to have a skull, right?
You got it, right?
And you see the Iron Maiden like letterhead. When I saw it, I was like,
course.
wow, they really blew this over the top in the art department. I'm sure they had a really good time with it
Yeah.
too.
I know.
Hopefully we don't get sued by Eddie,
Yeah, right. Yeah. Awesome. Well, John, really
It was a
appreciate
pleasure,
it, man. Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I'm looking forward to listening to the rest of those episodes, and good luck with it. And next time you have your next series, we'll have to have you back on to talk about it again.
Cool. Thanks so much. It's been a blast.
Awesome. All right. Thanks a lot, John.
Have a good one.
Take care, bud.
You too.
Take care, bud. Bye-bye.